By the end of this presentation, you will know how to explain the difference between general instructional objectives and specific learner outcomes. You'll know how to determine measurable verbs, and you'll know how to utilize resources for writing learning targets. Learning targets is a broad term used by educational professionals to explain the direction and goal of a lesson, course, or unit. Most often, we post learning targets in our classrooms to show exactly what the focus will be for the class period. Having a learning target or several learning targets is critical to ensuring that the efforts of instruction are moving forward and in the right direction. The learning targets explain clearly what students should be able to know and do, or what the goal is that they should have accomplished by the end of the learning segment. There are two types of learning targets that teachers use most often. Now, to be clear, most educators don't readily use these terms. They call both types learning targets, or sometimes they're called learning objectives. However, we will learn the specific terminology so that you have the language to explain the two distinct types of learning targets that are commonly used. First is the GIO, or General Instructional Objective. Its name explains a lot. It's a broad or general statement for the teacher that explains the focus for the unit or course. Often, GIOs are provided to teachers by their school districts. These GIOs are often filled with the broad concepts and understandings that are expressed in the Minnesota Academic Standards and benchmarks. SLOs, or Specific Learner Outcomes, are similar but have a few different characteristics. They are also explained by their name. They are specific, rather than general statements, about what the learner will be able to know or do by the end of the learning segment, usually a single lesson. These statements are most often created by the teacher based on the next steps their students need in order to meet the GIOs for the unit or course. SLOs are typically bite-size, while GIOs are a whole meal of learning. SLOs are measurable and student-friendly. They are the kind of statements that can be checked off as students accomplish them. For example, the learning targets that we might see for a kindergarten hygiene unit on dental health might look like this. There is a health standard that says students will comprehend concepts related to health promotion and disease prevention to enhance health. One of the benchmarks says, identify how to take care of the body, i.e. teeth, eyes, bones, etc. Think for a minute about what a GIO and some SLOs could look like if they were based on this statement and benchmark. Pause the video and jot down some ideas. Now, to be clear, there certainly could be more GIOs and more SLOs. This is simply an example of how the two types of learning targets connect to each other. And actually, there are many different ways to approach that standard and benchmark. Here is just one possibility. The GIO, the overarching bigger concept, could be students will be able to understand and the process for maintaining healthy teeth and gums. Then a first SLO could be students will be able to identify the supplies needed to brush their teeth. They aren't getting anywhere without a toothbrush and some toothpaste, right? The next thing to conquer would be that students will be able to apply the correct amount of toothpaste to the toothbrush. And lastly, students will be able to explain the steps involved in brushing their teeth. If we wanted a fourth SLO, we could say that students would be able to demonstrate correct teeth brushing. When writing learning targets, teachers have to think about and identify each little step in learning that needs to occur. There are a few additional things to be aware of when writing learning targets. They should be measurable. Now, there are a lot of ways to measure, so you have many options, but the verbs that you choose are important. Your statements should be clear, concise, and even better, student-friendly. Many teachers have chosen to write learning targets as I can statements to take that point home. Lastly, and this is tricky, avoid writing learning targets that describe an activity. Here's an example. Students will create a timeline to show the progression of World War I. Measurable? Yes. Clear and concise? Yes. Student-friendly? I think so. The challenge comes with the question of being activity-driven. Is this the point that students should show that they can create timelines? Or is the point that students can show that they understand the progression of World War I? I guess it's probably about the content rather than the activity. Do you agree? So the learning target should be, students will show the progression of World War I in 5 to 7 key events. See the difference? Now students can do a timeline, but they also could just tell you about those 5 to 7 events, or they could create a poster or a slideshow or a variety of ways to show their learning. And let's talk about verbs for a minute. The verbs that you choose for your learning targets, especially for the SLOs, are critical because they show the level of thinking or understanding that's required. Which of the verbs on this list would you be able to clearly measure? Which ones would be tricky? Solve, sort, write, recite, and identify are the measurable verbs in this list. They are easily identified by a teacher as being accomplished or not, whereas the ones in red would be challenging and up for discussion at the very least. Choose your verbs wisely so that they are easily measured. I have a great place for you to find some measurable verbs for your learning targets. Bloom's Taxonomies, there are several, Google them, is a hierarchy of verbs that were compiled by a committee of college professors who wanted to simplify the writing of learning targets. Thank you, Dr. Bloom. When you've mastered GIOs and SLOs, the next step will be to scaffold them so that you're using increasingly rigorous verbs, moving up the list from basic understanding to the higher order thinking skills of application and analysis and creation. It's okay if you aren't quite ready for that today, just remember that Bloom's Taxonomy can help. Let's play Is It a Learning Target? Swabat is cool learning lingo for students will be able to. Now you're on the inside. Which is a learning target? Is it A, students will be able to identify the sequence of the water cycle, or B, students will be able to understand the sequence of the water cycle? Both are correct. Now, which one is more measurable? A is definitely a better learning target because it uses the verb identify, which is measurable, while understand isn't. You can use the word understand in your GIO, but it should be avoided in your SLO. Let's try another one. A. I can use PEMDAS to solve equations. Remember that from algebra class? Or B. I can explain how to use PEMDAS to solve equations. Both are well-written learning targets, and both have very different measures, right? A measures if students can actually use PEMDAS, and B measures if students are able to explain it. As the teacher, you would need to decide which was more important to you. Maybe students should have to do both. And the last one, TLW, stands for the learner will. Is it A, the learner will mix paint to develop shadows in a portrait? Or is it B, the learner will demonstrate the effect of use of shading? Well, again, they're both learning targets, but they're a unique set. One is a GIO and one is an SLO that goes with it. Can you identify which is which? B is the GIO, the broad overarching concept for the unit, and A is the learning target for that lesson or series of lessons. When students can master A, they're on their way to showing that they have achieved B.